I think I should be coming
Just
just online.
Oh,
Yeah.
usually.
Yeah.
Are we doing shift review? How are we doing?
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه وعلى. If you want to keep your camera off, the camera rule is for people that aren't participating and know you'll participate. So whatever you're comfortable with. At least in my classes, whatever you're comfortable with. So inshallah, we'll be starting the last third of the Jami' of Tirmidhi. You guys went over the methodology last time, right? You with Shaykh Farhan methodology of Tirmidhi or no?
As in like his classifications?
Yeah. Did you go over anything related to his biography and methodology at all?
That's what we did. Everyone using methodology,
Like how he organized his book and how he structured it and stuff like that.
Yeah, high level doing.
Okay. So we're starting from the end of the book. It's not as I guess important to know his methodology for the second half of the book, pretty much because it is less related to fiqh than the beginning of the book. The beginning of the book is very fiqh heavy, and so you're going to need to understand how Imam Tirmidhi talks about different opinions and how Imam Tirmidhi categorizes different things. For this, you will come across different terms. There'll be a little bit in terms of when he grades a hadith, calls it Hasan Sahih or calls it Sahih or what have you. So that will take a little bit of getting used to. But the general idea is that you have you have Sahih then in between that you have a little bit lower than that is Hasan Sahih, and then Hasan, and so on and so forth, right? So without understanding the technical details, just understand that there is a hierarchy, essentially. Just being able to recognize that at this stage is good enough. So Imam Tirmidhi, this book is known as Al-Jami', it's also known as Sunan. Imam Tirmidhi never really called it the Sunan, but that name became popularized because it does qualify as, it does meet the criteria for something to be categorized as a Sunan. The four of the 6 books besides Bukhari and Muslim are known as the Sunan Arba'a. And for different reasons like that, it became popular as the Sunan of Tirmidhi, but it is more accurately titled as the Jami' of Imam Tirmidhi. Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, rahimahullah, he has a whole risala on the title of the book of Imam Tirmidhi. So understanding how Imam Tirmidhi deals with difference of opinion, and when his methodology in bringing referencing other opinions. So he'll say this is the opinion of so and so, and this is the opinion of so and so, and this is the opinion of so and so. So right now, this is, you could say, it falls under Aqaid almost, and then we'll get into Abwab Sifat al-Jannah, and then you have later on we'll have Da'awat and Manaqib and whatnot. And so in those things, there aren't really fiqh discussions that really come up. So he's not going to be mentioning the different opinions, the different fiqh opinions. So you're not going to be dealing with that type of those types of things in this part of the book. Whereas in the beginning of the book, like the first half of the book, it'll be like, oh, this is the opinion of this person, and this is the opinion of this person, and this is the opinion of this person, right? He'll mention the difference of opinion and discuss those very briefly.
Does he attribute what he thinks is most correct? Does he attribute what he thinks is most correct, or does he just bring
no, it's more like comparative fiqh, like this is the opinion of this person. Or I believe he does, actually.
How do you know what he's saying?
I believe he does for the most part. I know he does in certain places. I can't speak to what the majority is. He does do that. And so over here at the top of the book, he'll mention the full name: الجامع المختصر من السنن عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ومعرفة الصحيح والمعلول وما عليه العمل. And so the idea of the title, in those days, titles were quite long. The idea was that the title is explanatory, and it explains the goal of the book. Kind of, it summarizes the key objectives of the book, what that book is going to discuss, etc. So it's a jami'. Right? Jami', you talked about the qualification, what qualifies something as a jami'. It's mukhtasar, meaning it's not gonna be it's not gonna have every single hadith in the topic, but it's gonna pick maybe 1 or 2 hadith from each chapter, and then Imam Tirmidhi has something unique that he does, where he says what fil bab. So anything that would have fit in this chapter from a different sahabi, he'll mention that, and we'll come across examples of that. So it's mukhtasar min as-sunani an Rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, right? These are this hadith. He's not focusing on athar. So he says min as-sunani an Rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and then ومعرفة الصحيح والمعلول. One thing that Imam Tirmidhi does is he highlights he grades the hadith, and if there are defects, he'll highlight different points in the chain of narrators, that there's this weak narrator in the hadith, there's this issue, there's that issue. So ومعرفة الصحيح والمعلول, that he will discuss the isnad, وما عليه العمل, and he's also going to discuss the fiqh as well. So he's highlighting all of these points through the title.
You said, so in the Sunnah, they're the most important reports related to the chapter from the Prophet, right? Hadith, but then you said he's unique in that he brings.
So he'll bring this, he has this term that he uses, wafil bab. So then after any chapter, he'll bring one hadith or two hadith. He'll bring a very small number of hadith, and then at the end, he'll say, wafil bab. And then he'll mention the name of, more often than not, he'll mention different sahaba. وَفِي الْبَابِ عَنْ أَبِي هُرَيْرَةَ وَعَائِشَةَ وَكَذَا وَكَذَا رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عنْهُ, right? So he's going to mention these names. The purpose of that is essentially he's saying that in this chapter, there are a hadith that would fit, that aren't necessarily the same exact hadith, but they would fit under this chapter heading. However, for brevity, for the sake of being brief, I'm not going to include this in the chapter, but I'll reference to it that these are a hadith that come from these sahaba that fit under this chapter heading.
Not realistically, but just like extra.
Yeah, extra references.
Related to
See also the hadith of this person, that person. And later scholars have made an effort to try to highlight what those hadith would be.
But the purpose isn't to highlight, I guess when you distinguish between the Prophet and the Sahaba, is the purpose to distinguish the reports of the Prophet from other additional reports from the Sahaba? Or is it
no, these are hadith of the Prophet that he's referencing. But the reason a hadith, what is a hadith? A hadith is narrated through a particular sahabi. So you covered in Taysir the difference between a shahid and a tabi'. What differentiates a shahid and a tabi'? No, when you say this hadith is a shahid of another hadith, or this hadith is mutaba'a, is a right, of another hadith. The difference is mutaba'a is where you have the same hadith narrated through a different chain, versus a shahid is you have a completely different hadith. What differentiates it at the lowest level, it's qualified as mutaba'a if the sahabi is shared. So if the sahabi is shared and potentially more narrators beyond the sahabi as well is shared, then that's considered the same hadith, and so it's considered mutaba'a. If you have even the sahabi is different, then it's considered a completely different hadith, and so that's considered. Then if you have the same wording, the same matan coming from a different sahabi, that's considered a separate hadith. So that would be a shahid. So he's saying there's these shawahid from these other sahabi.
So it's the same, it's not new hadith, it's the same hadith.
It's the same, no. So a shahid would be the same matan.
Yep.
A shahid would be the same matan, right? Or a similar matan.
Yep.
Now, what Imam Tirmidhi is saying, he's not saying these are necessarily shawahid and they're the exact same wording, the exact same matan. What he's saying is there's hadith that fit under this chapter heading. So if I say, for example, if we have باب ما جاء في صفة شجر الجنة, right? Or right. Just as an example, let's if I can find an example, right? But you have a chapter heading, the trees of Jannah or the levels of Jannah or what have you, right? You're like, okay, there's other hadith related to the trees of Jannah that aren't necessarily, they could be the same matan, they could be a different matan, but there are different hadith coming from a different sahabi.
Makes sense. I guess from from like an English perspective, it's like you're not including it in the main text, but you're still including it. So like,
Yeah, I mean, there isn't an exact English equivalent.
it's technically part of the book, it's just like,
It's not, it's part of the book in the sense that it's, what's part of the book is that he's referencing that there are other hadith related to this topic. So he's indicating that there are further resources, you're just gonna have to look it up yourself. So if you want to read up on this topic or whatever, right? One other thing that Imam Tirmidhi has, which is unique, is he has, not completely unique, some authors have it, some authors don't, is he has his Ilal al-Saghir, which is in the beginning of the first volume, which essentially he talks about, it's a book on Ilal. Ilal are hidden defects, but he talks about his methodology as well. He talks about his teachers, he talks about where he's getting the fifth opinions that he references from, etc. So it's almost like an introduction to the book. That's why oftentimes it's published along with the book. So it's like an introduction to the book. That will probably be covered at the end of the year instead of the beginning of the year. Although that does seem counterintuitive, but it will help in the sense that now once you've kind of been exposed to Imam Tirmidhi for a year, then when you get to it, you can connect the dots and it'll be easier to understand. So inshallah, at the end of the year, hopefully we will get around to doing that, either myself or Sheikh Farhan. And in terms of okay. And then in terms of the book, inshallah, we will start with Abwab Sifat al-Jannah an Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. But last year I started off translating everything and it slowed us down a lot. Since you guys have covered Mishkah, and I guess you've covered a lot of the hadith, your vocab is a bit stronger. I was thinking that this year you don't start off translating. And it's basically, if there's anything that needs explanation, I'll explain the translation. If there are any questions in the translation, you guys can ask and we kind of go that way, just because we have a lot to cover.
we need to speak the Arabic.
Read the Arabic, highlight different points. I will be making reference to a footnote a lot. And so highlight different footnotes that are relevant, and only translating those things that are necessary. Is that fine with you guys? If needed, you guys can keep sunnah.com open on your computers and follow along with that, if that will be helpful. But I think not translating every single thing will help speed us up, because what happened last year is towards the end of the year, then we had to towards the end of the year we had to basically speed up and didn't get to focus as much on the hadith that were at the end of the book.
But for our own Arabic practice, we do recommend translating. Like not
Focus
live,
on
but not live, but like to actually, if you're doing side by side or at home, just to know, make sure we're getting the Arabic.
make sure you're understanding the Arabic. If there's anything in class, there's any translation that doesn't make sense, ask. Anything that's unclear, ask. But we won't do a word for word translation of everything, because that'll slow down the class. Is that fine with you? Yeah, it works. So make sure to ask, even if you're online. Okay.
Yes, true.
So I guess before we get started, um, references if you need to. Um, if you need to reference anything, look up anything. You have commentaries of the most famous commentary of Tirmidhi is التحفة الأحوذي by Mubarak Furi. There are other commentaries on Tirmidhi, but they do not, most of them are not complete. And so the section that we're covering will not have necessarily other commentaries. You can also look for the hadith. If it comes up in Mishka, then you can look it up in Mulla Ali Qari's Mirqat al-Mafatih if you want to read further on the hadith. And then there's modern commentaries as well. There is Muhammad Adam, Ethiopi, passed away not too long ago. A modern scholar, but he has commentaries on, I believe, all of the 6 works, which are essentially encyclopedic commentaries taken from different works. And so he's gathered he's gathered things from different commentaries in one place, essentially. Muhammad ibn Ali ibn Adam al-Ethiopi. And so he has commentaries. His commentary on the Tirmidhi is called إتحاف الطالب الأحوذي في شرح جامع الإمام الترمذي. And so he has a commentary on Tirmidhi and Nasa'i. And it seems that's about it. I thought he has on Muslim as well. I thought he had it on all 6. But that's also something that you can reference as well, if there's something you want to look up after class or whatnot. In terms of looking at narrators, one thing I had students do at the beginning of last year was look up the biographies of some of the more common Sahaba and present on those. So we'll be doing that this year as well. I'll assign those next week, inshallah, but just be prepared for that. And when I assign that next week, I will tell you the references that you can use and how you can look that up. Besides that, I'll share some resources that will help you, that you can look at in your own time talk about the more common chains of narrators. And so I will go ahead and share that right now. We won't be covering that in class, but if you're interested in getting a better idea of that kind of understanding, the asanid better, this will be helpful. I'll share that with you guys right now. Mhm.
So, with the Shannon, like,
Mhm.
is that considered to be like, will you find all those same ratios in basically the gender, but it's just a
No.
shorter book, it's completely different?
No, there'll be some narrations that are shared and some narrations that are different.
What's the reason for that? Is the difference in grading?
It's a different, I mean, the criteria is different. I mean, it's a different book altogether.
Don't you have chapters on Manetha and like description?
You do. But I guess you could say criteria. The criteria is different. The goal is different.
You know what the difference is? Like,
I don't know off the top of my head. Well, it's year 4. And then so I shared 2 PDFs. They will help. They'll help give you an idea of the more common asanid understanding, so that when you're reading the books, you could say the majority of the hadith that you read, if you learn those narrators, then the majority of the hadith that you're reading, you'll have at least, if not you'll have a good portion of the isnad. You'll be familiar with a good portion of the isnad, but the majority of the hadith you're reading.
What's the difference between the two books?
They're structured differently.
There will be overlap.
There will be overlap. There will be overlap, but there are some differences in terms of the goals and the structuring. Yeah. Okay. So with that, we'll start with أبواب صفة الجنة عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Before we start, so you have the dunya and the akhirah. Dunya is on what pattern in terms of sarf?
As in like.
What is it?
like that.
Okay, yeah, it has a not alif mamduda, it has a alif maksura at the end. But what is it? What pattern is that? It's the pattern of fu'la. It's on the pattern of fu'la, which is the feminine form of the ism al-tafdeel. Why is it dunya and akhirah? They're both feminine because it's assumed to be the sifa of dar. Dar is one of those words that's feminine. It'll come up. If it didn't come up, it'll come up, right? It's feminine because the tasghir is duwaira. So it's feminine, even though the mukabbal, the normal form, doesn't have a ta marbut at the end. But the ism al-tasghir has a ta marbut at the end, and so that's why it's feminine. So dar is feminine, its sifa is also going to be feminine. So when you say dunya, you're saying essentially ad-daru dunya. And when you say al-akhirah, it's essentially ad-daru al-akhirah. And so that's why it's feminine. So dunya and the akhirah. And both are hadith created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They are in existence and they were created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so they exist as we speak. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam on numerous occasions on Isra and Mi'raj, he visited heaven and hell. And on numerous occasions, he talks about being shown heaven and hell. And so the hereafter, Jannah and Jahannam, are in existence as we speak. And so the dunya goes until the day of judgment, al-yawm al-akhir, as it's known, the last day, and then the akhirah commences after that. And so that's why the day of judgment is called al-yawm al-akhir, because it's the last day essentially of the dunya before the akhirah starts. And some will categorize it where they'll say you have dunya, barzakh, and akhirah, and they'll say that there's these three realms as well. But if you simply categorize the existence to dunya and akhirah, then that would be the categorization. In terms of the hereafter, we have to believe in Jannah and Jahannam, and that these are the destinations of every human for eternity. In terms of the details, there are certain details that are absolutely necessary to believe, certain details that are not as necessary, meaning if someone doesn't believe in them, they are still within the fold of Islam. And there's also the discussion when we're talking about the hereafter. The same words are used to describe the things in the akhirah as they are in the dunya. And this is by form of isti'ara. Metaphorically, they're used that way. As we know, the Prophet ﷺ said, that there's nothing that can compare to it. You can't even comprehend what the akhirah is going to be like. But these are used to make it easier for a person to grasp, essentially, to make it easier for someone to understand what it will be like, what Jannah will be like, what Jahannam will be like.
How do you consider it?
So nothing is going to be completely literal. The point is that they are given the same names because there are some similarities, but at the end of the day, we can't fully comprehend the hereafter, right? Because we haven't, like it was interesting, I was talking to a friend, right, whose son has like very severe allergies. So the diet's very restricted. And he's like, when certain fruits come up on tests and whatnot, and they assume that the kid knows the color of the fruit or what the fruit is like, right? He struggles with those questions. He's like in elementary school, in like first grade or whatever. He struggles with those questions because he's never seen a pomegranate, for example, or he's never ate a pomegranate. So he doesn't know what a pomegranate's like. Right? Even though he might then start to understand as you explain or whatever, right? But if it was explained as like in a different way, then he might be able to comprehend what it is, right? So it's kind of that idea that you haven't seen it, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is using these methods, these words to describe them so that it's easier for us to get even somewhat of an idea of what it's going to be like without fully understanding it. Um, and and then we have the question arises, why is there such a detailed description? And where do we get such a detailed description? The Prophet ﷺ was shown Jannah and Jahannam in the Mi'raj, as well as being shown it multiple times in while he was sleeping or in an awakened state without physically going. And so through that we have a detailed description, and so that we have that motivation to work towards Jannah, stay away from Jahannam. With that, inshallah, we will get started. We'll go until like 8:45, 8:50, so that you guys have a break and you have time to make it over for Dr. Akram's class. It's on the left side, 104, where I found this classroom was last year. Before starting any class of hadith, it is the practice of teachers of hadith that they read what's known as al-musalsal bil-awwaliyah. I am not a teacher by any means, and this is I'm essentially here because there's no one else more qualified to be teaching this or to be studying this with you guys. But following in that tradition, we'll start with that. The Musalsal bil-Awwaliyah says the tasalsul goes back to Sufyan ibn Uyayna, rahimahullah ta'ala, and then from there the tasalsul ends. Sufyan ibn Uyayna is the tabi'i, one of the greatest of the tabi'in. وبالسند المتصل منا إلى الإمام سفيان بن عيينة رحمه الله تعالى قال حدثنا أبو قابوس مولى عن سفيان بن عيينة عن أبي قابوس مولى عبد الله بن عن عبد الله بن عمرو بن العاص رضي الله عنهما أنه قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم الراحمون يرحمهم الرحمن تبارك وتعالى ارحموا من في الأرض يرحمكم من في السماء أو قال يرحموا من في الأرض يرحمكم من في السماء. I've heard this hadith from a number of teachers. I've heard it from most notably Mufti Rafi' al-Uthmani rahimahullah, Mufti Taqi al-Uthmani, I'm just going to mention the main teachers that I studied with. Otherwise, I've heard it from because it's so common. I've heard it from many other teachers, but in Medina from Sheikh Hamid ibn Ahmed ibn Akram al-Bukhari, who was a teacher in Masjid Nabawi until very recently. Sheikh Safwan ibn Adnan Dawoodi, who is originally from Damascus and has been in Medina for many years, probably over 40, 50 years, and many other teachers besides that. And so we start with that, and then we begin with the book, inshallah. In terms of reading hadith, you guys have covered how to start the reading of hadith. So when you're reading a book that is musnad, that has asanid, you guys talked about how to start off. Have you guys started the book yet? Sheikh Farhan? Okay. Okay. So when you start off a book of hadith that is musnad, um, you start with reading the isnad. Historically, initially, the teacher or the student, whoever is reading, would read the entire isnad to the Prophet ﷺ, for each hadith. Then over time, the asanid got shorter. They got longer. Asanid got longer, and so it became very, very difficult. And so at the beginning of each class, they would read the entire isnad going back to the book, and then thereafter they would say وَبِسَنَدٍ مُتَّصِلٍ مِنَّا, or something along those lines. And then as that happened, then the teacher, as time progressed, then the teacher eventually, he would mention his asanid in the beginning of, mention his asanid once, and then every time after that, you would essentially just read the isnad that's mentioned in the book. So one is every single dose, they would talk, they read the entire isnad at least once, going from the teacher all the way to the author.
And then
Earlier than that, they would read the entire isnad. So for example, you read a Shifa, that Qadi Iyad. He's going to mention his asanid going back to the different books, even though the books are there. So he's not going to say that I narrate from, he's not going to say Imam Muslim narrates. He's going to say, he'd mention his entire isnad, including what's before Imam Muslim and including the isnad that Imam Muslim has. So he's going to mention all of that, right? So in earlier times, that was more common. They would mention the whole isnad. That's how it started. Then to make it easier, they mentioned the isnad to the particular book at the beginning of the dose, and then they would just read the isnad in the book for the rest of the hadith. And then over time, what happened is once the teacher would read the isnad once, or inform the student of their isnad once at the beginning of the dars, for example, and then wouldn't mention it again, basically, and then just read the asanid from the book.
That's what I understand. So the last two, basically saying the second one was every class they would read their asanid from the book, but then the last one was going to read it once and then just.
Yeah.
But then it's the same thing. It's just frequency.
Yeah. So in terms of isnad, you have two types of asanid. You have asanid that are based on, you have different levels of ijaza, right? Which come up in Taysir, right? But to simplify it, you have ijaza that are coupled with sama', with actually reading the book from the teacher, and then you have ijazat that are not such. They're just ijazah. That's ijazah bil riwayah without actually studying the book with the teacher. And then you have that whole discussion of ijazah that comes up in the different levels of ijazah and whatnot. And sometimes you'll have ijazah based on reading only a portion of the book, and then ijazah in the rest of the book. And so you have this genre of awa'il, for example, where you'll read the first hadith of a bunch of books to a teacher, and then the teacher will give you ijazah in the rest of the book. The idea of ijazah is one that is part of our tradition, and it is important, but it should not take, the priority is learning and understanding. If someone has a lower isnad but has better understanding, applies the knowledge more, they are potentially better in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than someone who has a higher isnad. And all of these things that we do, right, our purpose is to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our intentions, right, it's talked about in the orientation, right? Intentions are extremely important. Why are we doing this, etc. And so we study the hadith for to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to get closer to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, learn more about him, and to apply it into our lives, and then afterwards propagate it to others as well. Right? And so that is the primary perspective, the primary objective. There is blessings and there is barakah in this concept of isnad. And so it is something that is praiseworthy and something that is good, but it should not take priority over your learning. And so in terms of my asanid to the Jami' of Tirmidhi, I studied it initially in Karachi from Sheikh Rashid Ashraf, rahimahullah. I studied the majority of the first half of Tirmidhi from him. Parts of the first half, he had gotten ill for a period, and so part of the first half of Tirmidhi was taught to us by Sheikh Aziz al-Rahman of the Ulum Karachi, and the second half was taught by Sheikh Abdullah Darmi, who is one of the senior teachers in Darul Uloom Karachi. Both Sheikh Rashid Ashraf rahimahullah and Sheikh Aziz al-Rahman studied the book from Mufti Taqi, who then studied from Mullah Salimullah Khan, who was a student of Hussein Ahmad al-Madani rahimahullah. And his asanid are known. Sheikh Abdullah al-Badmi was studied it directly from, he's from the same tabaqa as Mufti Taqi, Mufti Rafi rahimahullah. So he studied it directly from Sheikh Salimullah Khan, who again studied from Sheikh Hussein Ahmad al-Madani. And then I studied this book in Medina from Sheikh Hamid. He's known as Sheikh Hamid Akram Bukhari, but this is an example where you're doing nisbah is done to the grandfather. His father's name was Ahmad, Hamid ibn Ahmad ibn Akram al-Bukhari, who is still teaches in Medina, and he is one of the Musnidin of this time, and so he has numerous asanid for this book that can be found in his Thabat. And so when we start reading the book, we start by saying we're gonna say وَبِالسَّنَدِ الْمُتَّصِلِ مِنَّا, with the chain that is connected from us to, and then you mention the name of the author, and we want to mention the entire name of the author every time. So when we start, we're going to say وَبِالسَّنَدِ الْمُتَّصِلِ مِنَّا إِلَى الْإِمَامِ, and then you can add different titles out of respect for the author. Mufti Rafi rahimahullah, when we were doing Sahih Muslim with him, he would add the title Al-Humam and إلى الإمام الهمام الحافظ, but you can add whatever titles you deem appropriate. إلى الإمام الهمام الحافظ أبي عيسى محمد بن عيسى بن ثورة الترمذي رحمه الله تعالى, and then you make dua رحمه الله تعالى, and you make dua for Allah to allow us to benefit from his knowledge and from the blessings of this book. So in the subcontinent generally it will be وَمَتَّعْنَا بِعُلُومِهِ. Some will say وَمَتَّعْنَا بِعُلُومِهِ وَفُيُوضِهِ. Some will say وَمَتَّعْنَا, Mufti Rafi rahimahullah, he adjusted it and said وَمَتَّعْنَا بِعُلُومِهِ وَبَرَكَاتِهِ, because fuyud is maybe a little bit more controversial for some. Fuyud it's a term used in tasawwuf more so. But it's almost like barakat. It's very similar to barakat, right? The blessings, the I don't know an exact translation, but it's used in tasawwuf more so. So because it's inclined towards that, Mufti Rafiq rahimahullah would say that use barakat. That's a more universal term, right? That people would be comfortable with, and even that in certain circles will be controversial as well. And in the Arab world, oftentimes you'll see instead of matta'a, they'll say وَنَفَعَنَا بِحُلُومِهِ. Right? And so وَمَتَّعَنَا to allow us to enjoy, to benefit from essentially the knowledge of the scholar and the blessings of the scholar and his works. Right? So when we say مَتَّعَنَا بِعُلُومِهِ وَبَرَكَاتِهِ, that's essentially we're making dua that Allah allows us to take that benefit. Nafa'a and matta'a have very similar meanings. So we make dua for that, and then ameen, and then you say qala, and then you read the isnad of the author, and that is read in the beginning of the dars, and then after that you would simply say wa bihi, and with it, meaning with the connected chain. So وَبِهِ وَبِالسَّنَدِ الْمُتَّصِلِ مِنَّا. Right? So instead of saying that again, you just have the dhamir referring back to it and say وَبِهِ, and then you say قَالَ, and you read the hadith. That make sense?
So you're saying.
So for example, over here, I'll read the first chapter to explain that to you guys. Okay? الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. وبالسند المتصل منا إلى الإمام الحافظ أبي عيسى محمد بن عيسى بن سورة الترمذي رحمه الله تعالى ومتعنا بعلومه وبركاته آمين. قال أبواب صفة الجنة عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. قال باب ما جاء في صفة شجر الجنة. And so we said that in the beginning. Some people will read وبالسند المتصل منا. I read it at the very beginning. Some will read it at the beginning of the first hadith. So they'll just read the chapter heading as is, and then they'll read it. Either way, it's just a matter of convention. It's not that big of a deal. And so I already said وَبِالسَّنَدِ الْمُتَّصِلِ مِنَّا, the whole thing. So now we get to this hadith. And so I'll say وَبِهِ قال حدثنا عباس بن محمد الدوري. Now you have قال and حدثنا. You have حدثنا over here. قال is not mentioned. This came up in Taysir. Whenever you have حدثنا or أخبرنا, there is going to be a قال that is مقدر. Sometimes it will be, if there's two narrators, it may be قال in the dual form. If there's three, it may be قالوا, but essentially, it's more often than not, it's going to be قال, which is مقدر. So you'll say قال حدثنا عباس بن محمد الدوري قال حدثنا عبيد الله بن موسى. And then with عن, there's nothing going to be مقدر before عن. You're simply going to say عن شيبان عن فراس عن عطية عن أبي سعيد الخدري رضي الله عنه. And the practice of the scholars of the subcontinent is that they will, along with saying رضي الله عنه, they'll say رضي الله عنه وعنهم, including into that all of the scholars in the chain. And some scholars object to this idea. And they say this is essentially saying it's not, this is not the practice that's been passed down. Essentially, this was something that was introduced later on, and the practice has always been just to say radiyallahu anhu. But many scholars have, even Arab scholars who are aware of this, have approved of it as well. So it's a matter of preference at the end of the day. And if you guys do not have an objection, then I would. That is what we will be going with in this class. So you would say radiyallahu anhu wa anhum, meaning an radiyallahu an as-sahabi wa an rijal al-isnad. It's you're specifically mentioning. I mean, you're specifically you have this idea of تعميم بعد التخصيص, right? من كان عدوا لله وملائكته ورسله. That's تخصيص بعد التعميم. But you have this idea where you specifically highlight someone, so it's giving them a level of honor and respect. So when you're saying radiyallahu anhu specifically for the Sahabi, then you're highlighting their status, and then anhum, recognizing the rest of the narrators in the chain.
But you said so from what we said in the is there a reason? Is the reason that they repeat it, or even when you say wabi, like for every single hadith? Like in my head, it's kind of like you're reading all the same book. So like, why would you repeat it?
Because you're still making reference to the stat. You're still supposed to make reference to the isnad. The ideal is to read the entire isnad, but that gets too long. So this is the workaround, essentially.
What I'm saying is,
there are some that say that you don't even need to do that. You can just say قال حدثنا, and that's also fine.
because you've already referred to.
Yeah. So it's a matter of convention more than necessity. If that makes sense.
I'm just wondering, is there a reason, like in the sense of if you're ever going to read a book where you have two different assignees, that's the reason you need to connect each one appropriately.
No.
Because you've already said that.
Yeah.
At the beginning, right?
Mhm.
But it's probably more just out of motivation of honor that every single thing that we say
Yeah.
is connected to.
It's a matter of
Even to leave room. No room for
it's a matter of convention more than necessity, and that's why some will even leave that out. But most scholars, this is the practice of most scholars. Some will say wabihi, some will say wabihi ilayhi. They'll add the ilayhi as well. Wabihi is fine. عن أبي سعيد الخدري رضي الله عنه عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: في الجنة شجرة يسير الراكب في ظلها 100 عام لا يقطعها. وقال: وذلك الظل الممدود. وبه قال حدثنا قتيبة بن سعيد قال حدثنا الليث بن سعد عن سعيد بن أبي سعيد عن أبيه عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه وعنهم عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أنه قال: إن في الجنة لشجرة يسير الراكب في ظلها 100 عام. وفي الباب عن أنس وأبي سعيد رضي الله عنهما. This is an example of وفي الباب. It says there's similar hadith from Anas and Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiallahu anhum that would also corroborate this. There are shawahid essentially for this. They're not necessarily, they may or may not have the same method, but there are shawahid for this.
That makes sense. I thought when you said that they're bringing in more hadith, which it's just saying that addition.
Yeah. And scholars have compiled works on this topic, trying to figure out which hadith Imam Tirmidhi is referencing. هذا حديث صحيح. So what we're going to do is we'll read and unless the chapter is extremely long, we'll read the entire chapter and then discuss anything that needs to be discussed. وبه قال حدثنا أبو سعيد الأشج قال حدثنا زياد بن الحسن بن الفراتي القزاز عن أبيه عن جده عن أبي حازم عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه وعنهم أنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ما في الجنة شجرة إلا وساقها من ذهب هذا حديث غريب حسن.
If it's written sometimes the previous hadith said أنه قال then we added أنه.
So this is technically speaking, if you have عن followed by a قال عن فلان قال, then to make it grammatically sound you would need a أنه to make it grammatically sound. So again, it's a matter of convention. Some will add in the أنه and some will leave it implied. And so you'll see in certain hadiths, in certain times it'll be written in explicitly, certain places it will not be. And so when it's left out, some scholars would prefer to just read it as it's written, and some scholars would prefer to read read it even when it's not written. So skip essentially read annahu when it's written and not read annahu when it's not written. Either way is fine. It's probably easier for you guys not to worry about that right now. So that's why I didn't highlight that point. But, I'll get there. So we just finished reading it. Okay. In terms of the isnad, this is, you have hadith from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. Abu Sa'id, what's his full name? Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, what's his name? What's his actual name? Abu Sa'id is his kunya, right? Sa'ad ibn Malik ibn Sinan al-Khudri, rahimahullah, radiyallahu anhu, the hadith of his, where he says that essentially describing the shade of Jannah, the shade of the trees of Jannah as being so long that someone could ride 100 years. And he said, وَذَلِكَ الظِّلُّ الْمَمْدُودُ. This is in reference to the ayah in the Quran, وَظِلٍّ مَمْدُودٍ, right? Surah Waqi'ah, ayah 30, is mentioned in the footnote. And so it's reference to the ayah that when it says وَظِلٍّ مَمْدُودٍ, what is that referring to? And so this is tafsir al-Qur'ani bis sunnah, where the Prophet is doing tafsir of that ayah. The next hadith is a hadith of Abi Hurairah radiallahu anhu. Narrating from him is Sa'id ibn Abi Sa'id. This is Sa'id ibn Abi Sa'id al-Maqburi. You know al-Maqburi because he lived near a graveyard in Medina. And so he is one of the a prolific narrator of hadith. His name will come up again and again. And so he narrates from Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu a similar hadith. And then the last hadith from Abu Hurairah is, it says, there is no tree in Jannah except that its trunk, saq over here referring to the trunk of the tree, except that its trunk is made from gold. One discussion over here that comes up is, or there's two discussions. One is this talking about all the trees in Jannah or a specific tree? Most commentators mention that this is talking about a specific tree name, Tuba. So there's a specific type of tree in Jannah known as Tuba. And it extends to all the levels of paradise. But some mention that this is a description of all the trees of Jannah. The other question is that there is no sun or daylight in Jannah. That is something that is established through other in the other hadith. Um, but that doesn't mean that there won't be light in Jannah. Right? So there will be light, um, but there won't be the worldly concept of day and night. So when um, and so there won't be the worldly concept of day and night, but there will be light, and so there can be shadows still. It could also be metaphorical, meaning that it won't actually have a shadow, but if it were to have a shadow, then this is how long it would be. Um, so it can be that there may not be day and night as we know it in this world. Day and night in this world is based on the movement of the sun. So it may not have day and night in that sense. But there will be still a source of light in Jannah. There will still be light in Jannah. So it'll have a shadow based on that light, and the shadow will be this long. Or it's metaphorical, and there won't be shadows in Jannah. But if um, but if there were to be a shadow, then it would be this long. In terms of this last hadith, commentary mentioned that this last hadith about the trunks being of gold, this is something that's talking about all the trees of Jannah. So the first two hadith and the ones talking about the length of the tree, that is where the difference of opinion is. The last one is talking about all the trees of Jannah. We'll stop here for today, just so you guys have time to make it to the next class. In terms of some practices for the scholars that scholars have when you're reading a book, you should mark where you stop, put a date, and if possible also count out how many classes you spent, right? So this is class number 1, for example, al-majlis al-awwal, for example. But at a minimum, mark it and date it in your book that this is where you stop. Also, another convention is to write out who was present when you first started the book. Right? So it'll be an idea of who was there and who lasted till the end. So at the beginning of the book and the end of the book, write out who was present for the beginning and for the ending of the book. Those are just matters of convention related to Islam, right? This practice, being around has helped, for example, later on when trying to understand Asanid and try to figure out who studied what book from someone, whether they just have ijazah or they have sama' or whatnot, those types of things historically, because scholars had these practices, it allowed to pinpoint those types of details. So those are practices that scholars had, but at a minimum, mark where you stopped and the date, and date it. So.
What's the abbreviation convention for the year calendar? Like, you know, how we have this would be 9/6 or September 6th. Do you still do
Same thing, except you can put a half at the end. And for most of the world, it's day, month, year. Or for us, it's month, day, year. So more often than not, when you see Hijri, it'll be day, month, year in terms of the order. But whatever, as long as you know what it is that you have written down, that's fine. Today is the the 6th of August. 1446, right?
Mhm.
And September 9th. Okay. And you guys can, inshallah, you want to get going, you guys can start heading over. Assalamu alaikum.